All right. Okay, great. Good evening. I hope everyone both online and here can hear me. I'll try not to shout too loud. I do tend to talk fast, so just give me kind of a little hand signal if you need me to slow down. And feel free to ask questions throughout. For those at home, if you have questions, just go ahead and throw them into the chat box and I'll take a look at those at the end of the talk and try to answer them for you. So open to... Uh-oh. What just happened? There we go. Okay. Great. We've been having a few tech issues, but it looks like we're ready to go. Okay, good. We're going to talk about strawberries, one of my favorite things to grow. And they're a great thing to grow in the home garden because they aren't cheap, right? You know, just a little quart of strawberries can cost anywhere from $4 to $6. So growing them on your own at home is a great way to save some money. And also you get to pick them ripe, right? A lot of commercial berries are not picked at 100% ripeness. So if you grow them at home, you get them at, you know, their sweetest and juiciest state. So I've worked with strawberries quite a bit, starting back when I was living in California. I actually had a job with Extension down there in Sacramento County and worked with some growers in the Sacramento County area. And then most recently with OSU Extension, I've been doing some season extension research with day neutral strawberries here in Oregon as well. So love strawberries, happy to be here to talk with you. So there's a couple keys. Yes.
On the Zoom, it's only showing your original share screen, not the one that we're getting.
Let's see if we can fix that. Okay. Duplicate slideshow, maybe. Did that not do it?
Perfect.
Did that work?
Yeah, that looks good now.
Okay, so we're ready to go. I should give a shout out to when I first started at OSU, Dr. Bernadine Strick gave me her berry presentation. So some of the slides in this are from hers, but I have taken it and kind of put quite a bit of my own into it at this point as well, but I do want to acknowledge that. So keys to successful strawberry production include good sun exposure. You need at least 6 hours of direct sun per day. You want a soil that's really well drained, good draining soil. So they don't like to be, you know, they can get root rots and other types of issues if they're just sitting in puddles of water. You need to make sure that the pH is within range for this type of berry. A soil with good organic matter is always beneficial. Make sure they're irrigated well as well. We'll talk a bit more about all of this. And then, of course, you need to fertilize them properly, meaning the right type of fertilizer, the rate, and of course, the timing of application is important for that as well. So let's just go back and start. There's a number of native types of strawberries. Some of the best well-known ones are the Fragaria chiloensis, Fragaria vesca, and Fragaria virginiana. And so the vesca is from Europe, the virginiana from here in North America, and the chiloensis is from both the Pacific Northwest as well as the west coast of Chile down in South America. And all modern hybrids of strawberries come from the are based on a cross between the Fragaria virginiana and the chiloensis, and that's how we get our modern hybrids of Fragaria X ananassa. So just a couple of terms to understand the botany of a strawberry plant, but basically they have a crown system, and from that crown come the leaves, the trusses of fruit, which are clusters of fruit, as well as the runners, so these stolons that the plants like to send out, and from those stolon grow daughter plants. So you typically will have a mother plant, and then that will send out these runners, which will grow these daughter plants. And these daughter plants can root themselves and grow a genetically identical plant to the mother plant. And for some type of strawberries, it's okay to allow those daughters to root. And then for other types, you do want to actually remove the runners before they actually root themselves. So we'll talk about that a bit more. So yeah, I think I kind of went through all this, but basically, you know, again, there's these above ground runners. They will continue to root So typically you do want to remove them once they put out their first blind node, which you kind of see here. It's starting to leaf out a little bit. Their flowers are perfect flowers, so they have all the male and female parts to them. Each one of these pistils, which contains the stigma, style, and ovary, they all have to be pollinated for it to produce a really well-shaped fruit. If some of those are not pollinated, you may get what's referred to as catfacing, which is kind of a deformed fruit that doesn't have kind of that typical triangle shape at the tip. So while they do have all the male and female parts and can kind of pollinate themselves, they are self-fertile. Bees and other pollinators are really important to their pollination as well, because they basically take all the pollen from the stamens and then can kind of pass it and brush it all over all the stigmas of the flower as well, and ensure good pollination for that flower. They also have the sepals, which are the calyx, and that's essentially what becomes the kind of the cap of the strawberry fruit itself. Okay, so this is a truss of fruit, and there's usually like a primary fruit, and that's generally the best and biggest fruit that you'll get out of that inflorescence or that truss, that cluster of fruit. So berry size does tend to decrease as you go from primary, secondary, into tertiary fruits within that cluster. And the fruit itself is actually these little achenes that are on the fruit, and then the flesh-like part that we eat, that's actually the receptacle of the flower itself. So the fruit is essentially an aggregate fruit of all these little achenes. And then, as I noted, the sepals become the calyx that end up covering, providing the cap to the strawberry fruit itself. So there's three main types of strawberries. June bearers, which are probably a lot of you know here in Oregon. The hood strawberry is a June bearing strawberry. And so these are often sometimes referred to as short day strawberries, because they start initiating bud formation in the fall as the day length starts to get shorter. So that actual plant physiological process starts in the fall. They won't actually put out flowers and fruit until the following year, but the physiology within the plant is starting to kick into action there as the days are getting shorter in the fall. And so that they start producing buds under short day, and then they produce one big flush of fruit the following year in June. Typically, it's usually like June, July, but you get like 1 month where you go out and pick all the fruit off the plant, and then it's done for the year. It doesn't produce any more fruit. It can still put out vegetative growth, so it can send out leaves and things like that, but the plant at that point is done producing fruit for the year. These do produce many runners, which is okay in this type. In June bearers, it's okay to allow those runners to produce daughters and for the daughters to root themselves. So even though they produce a lot of runners, you don't actually have to remove them, which is a nice benefit of the plant. I will say too, a lot of the June bearing cultivars were kind of bred and developed for processing markets. So they don't always, this doesn't necessarily matter for home growers, but they don't have a long shelf life. They tend to have a much softer kind of fruit compared to, say, day neutrals, which have a firmer fruit to them and were produced and developed for fresh market to be sold in a fresh market. So they kind of are more shelf stable. They can kind of last longer. So these June bearers typically are a bit softer, but they're also typically very sweet. Because they were produced for kind of processing markets to be shipped off to go into jams and, ice creams and things like that. They have a real sweetness to them. There's also the everbearers, and sometimes these are referred to as long day cultivars, because they tend to really produce fruit as the day length gets longer, when you have like 12 hours or more sunlight during the day. So they tend to produce fruit during June and August. So you get kind of two main flushes of fruit, and then they're done. And they do tend to produce few runners. And then we have the day neutral cultivars. And these are the cultivars I've kind of been working with here in Oregon, but they tend to produce fruit based on temperature. So as long as the temperatures are between 40 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, they can produce, flowers and fruit. So you tend to have a much longer continuous harvest season from the day neutral cultivars. They'll produce fruit from May through October. So for a home gardener, if you just like having a continuous supply of berries throughout the summer to put your, your yogurt in the morning or whatever you do with them, then a day neutral cultivar is really the way to go. If you want just kind of a big flush of fruit to make some jams, you like to process the fruit, then a June bearing cultivar would be a great choice for that. So they do produce fewer runners, but with the day neutrals, you have to remove them, which is, maybe if you just have a couple plants at home, that's not a lot. But if you have an acre of strawberries, which I've had in some trials, it's quite a bit of work and it's very backbreaking. So that is one of the downfalls of them. The other thing I'll note is that everbearers are kind of being phased out to a certain extent. Usually what you see in the market are either the June bearing types or the day neutral types. Having said that, I've often seen day neutral cultivars like a Seascape labeled as an everbearing cultivar. So they are often, a lot of day neutral types are often mislabeled in plant nurseries. So just be aware of that, that you may still see everbearers out there, but sometimes it's interesting to go home and Google the varietal name and see what comes up about it. And you may find that it's actually a day neutral. Okay. So these are some of the good June bearing cultivar types if you're looking for suggestions. We have the Hood, which of course is probably one of the most popular strawberries here in Oregon. The Totem is also really good. You have the Benton, the Charm, Sweet Sunrise. All of these were bred kind of out of the OSU USDA center here, right here in Corvallis. So these are really local varieties that were developed to perform well here in Oregon under our conditions, our soil, our weather, etc. And they produce just really great fruit, very flavorful, especially the Hood. It's known as one of the best tasting berries around. Day neutrals, again, one of my favorites is the Albion. That's probably kind of the rock star of the day neutral. I think it was released back in 2009. And a lot of these varieties came out of the UC system, the UC strawberry breeding system. So they were bred, again, for the fresh market. They tend to have firmer fruit, and kind of have a longer shelf life as well. So Albion's a great one. I think that was released in 2009. It's quickly became the most popular strawberry, at least down in California, in commercial production. Seascape is also very good, very popular. A new one I tried, we did a varietal trial up at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center a couple of years ago. One of the ones we tried is the Sweet Ann, and I really liked it, and as did all the students who were working with us that summer. They loved the strawberry. It's not necessarily something I would recommend to commercial growers. It does have lower yields. Also, the fruit has kind of almost it's not quite that dark red that you typically see with strawberries. It's almost got like an orangish red color to it. So in a commercial market, it might not sell quite as well and you get lower yields, but certainly for the home garden, the flavor of it is just outstanding. Like just that typical strawberry flavor might be hard to find in local nurseries, but it's worth looking for. And then also the San Andreas and Monterey. And I will note that all of these day neutrals recommended here have been trialed in Oregon. So there's tons of different day neutral cultivars. And as I said, most of them came out of California where it's a lot hotter and sunnier and they have sandier soils and things like that. So just note that these have all been trialed and tested here in Oregon and are known to perform well up here in the Willamette Valley. Okay, so in terms of soil, they need a slightly acidic soil of 5.6 to 6.5. And it's important to, modify your soil before you actually plant into it. Because strawberries you can have in the ground for like 4 years, if you're feeding them and taking care of them well. So you want to make sure that the soil is what it needs to be. They really do prefer well-drained soil. So if you have a really poor draining soil, then put them into raised beds or containers. Add some organic matter, do what you need to do to improve the state of that soil so that it drains better. And then, it's always good to test your soil before planting as well. And if you're deficient in any nutrients, to go ahead and apply that. They do like boron. Boron is very important for fruit production and fruit fill as well. So that is one thing to take note of in a soil test. But be careful with boron. Boron's one of those things where you can go from deficient to toxic very quickly as well. So proper planting is really important. When you plant, you want to make the soil line is kind of level with the bottom of the crown of the plant. You don't want the crown to be too buried, or else you may be covering where it sends out those new leaves and trusses of fruit. And you don't want the roots to be exposed as well. If they're exposed to sunlight, they can really harden off, and that can impede transport of water and nutrients up into the plant. So you want to make sure that you're planting almost directly at the soil line. And you also want to make sure that the roots are not, bent when they are planted in the ground. They can get what's referred to as J rooting, where maybe the roots take kind of a J-like loop shape at the bottom, and that can cause the plants to be stunted and they won't grow quite as well. So make sure those roots go into the soil straight, and that the soil line goes just up to the base of the crown as well. And then, of course, once you plant them, you want to water them in really well. So this is just kind of a picture showing how you can use a trowel to kind of push down those roots and make sure that they're straight to prevent J rooting from occurring. And then after you plant, you do want to remove that first truss of flowers, that first inflorescence that comes out. It's good to remove those during the first year. You just have to do it once. That first year, remove that first truss of flowers or inflorescence. And that's going to help that plant really kind of establish a better root system. So that's important to do because, again, these are perennials or biennials, I should say. So they can be in the ground for several years. So you can grow strawberries a lot of different ways. You can grow them, in the flat ground where you don't do much except maybe throw some plants in the ground. You can grow them in raised beds, and those raised beds can either have frames around them or they can be unframed as well. I grow a lot in containers. I don't have a huge garden at home, and so I grow almost all my strawberries in either 1 or 2 gallon pots. So that's another way that you can grow them too. And what's nice is I was able, during things like the ice storm that we had this year, I was able to bring them inside and, make sure that they survived and everything like that. So they do grow well in containers. They don't need a huge pot or a lot of space to do well. If you're going to grow in containers, choose a day neutral type. They perform better. So typically with planting, and you typically plant in spring, you can plant in the fall as well. But I think and a lot of commercial growers have kind of turned to fall planting just because it's really hard, obviously, with our spring rain to get a tractor into the field and prepare your bed and go out and plant in the spring. So oftentimes they'll at least make their beds in the fall and either plant into them in the fall or make the beds and then plant into them in the spring. For home gardeners, you probably won't have access to plants until the springtime. I think most nurseries don't carry, small quantities of bare root plants in the fall. You typically see them being sold in the spring. So most home gardeners do end up planting in the springtime. But for a June bearing type, you're going to plant in the spring and you aren't going to get any fruit that first year. For a June bearing type, they won't actually produce fruit until that second fruiting season. For day neutral types, and here's another bonus of day neutrals, is you will plant that first year and you'll get a crop just a couple months later, in that summer. So you plant in the spring, and then starting in May, June, you're going to already have your first flush of fruit coming out. And you can grow strawberries for several years. Just note that with each successive year, the yield, so the amount of berries that you get, as well as the size of the berries, is going to decrease. The other thing I'll note is, having grown berries for several years, is that the pest incident within the plant and the health and the vigor of that plant itself will also decrease quite a bit over the years as well. You may end up with botrytis in year 2, and once that's kind of in there and you have those spores sitting there waiting, you're going to be battling that every year as well. So, but you can grow them for several years. I usually, most people remove them and replant after year 4. By that point, the berries there just aren't enough big berries to kind of keep them going. So it's better to go ahead, remove them, rotate them to a different area of your garden. Don't replant in the same area. But rotate them to another area of garden and start all over again with a fresh set of bare root plants. And one thing to note is you can always, like commercial growers in California, they plant them as annuals, right? They remove them after 1 year. and replant. A lot of growers here will grow them for maybe 2, maybe 3 years, and they usually replace them. So as a home gardener, you can kind of make that decision yourself. You obviously want to watch the berries. If you're like, I'm not getting a lot off this plant anymore, then go ahead and remove them and start over. So for day neutral types, they're grown in what's referred to as a matted row system, where the plants, you have these single plants planted down a row. They're about 15 inches apart. And if you have multiple rows, then you want about 3 to 4 feet between those rows. And these, again, with June bearers, you allow them to send out runners, and for those runners to go ahead and root themselves. So you start with just one plant, and then by the time that plant sends out runners and has rooted, you have what the photo shows on the right-hand side, but this huge dense canopy of mother and daughter plants growing together that forms what's referred to as a matted row. So that's typically the system that June-bearing types are grown in. You do have to maintain, if you have several rows, those daughters will grow into the aisle. So you may have to go through with a rake or a hoe and kind of train the daughter plants back into the row again and kind of weed out that aisle and keep it clean. But if you do so, then you'll have a good, nice, clean kind of compact matted row system that's easy to maintain. And then typically, once again, these are June bearers, so you get a big flush of fruit in June, early July. And then the plants that's it. They're done for the year. You aren't going to get any more fruit out of them. They're kind of tired out. And so then what you want to do is go through and remove all those old leaves. So that's referred to as renovation. So you go through and renovate the plants. You can just go ahead and cut off all the leaves of the plants and the runners. And then at that point is usually when you fertilize them as well. So they're typically fertilized in August, because again, then they have all that food that they need for when the days get shorter in the fall and they want to start bud and flower initiation again. So that's typically what's done. So again, mower trim plants just above the crown after the last fruit, then clean up the aisles. Once again, do any weeding you need to do, irrigate the plants, and then you go ahead and fertilize them, and they're ready to go for the following season. So this is for day neutral types. So they're typically grown in raised beds, sometimes referred to as hills or mounds. I think of them as unframed raised beds, basically, but usually the raised bed is maybe like 6 to 12 inches tall, or as tall as you can get it. And for these, you plant them about 12 inches apart, single plants. And again, you do want to remove the runners. For the day neutral types, if you allow those daughter plants to root themselves, they're going to basically be robbing energy from the mother plant and reduce the vigor of that mother plant, and you won't get quite as much fruit. The other thing you want to do is you really want to reduce competition from weeds. So with the June bearers, they form that matted row. So they're pretty much a mulch, they're providing the mulch themselves. They're suppressing any weeds below them, but because you do maintain plant spacing between these day neutral types, you can get a lot of weed competition between them. So that's why they're either, in commercial settings, they're grown with this plastic mulch. As a home gardener, you can use something like straw mulch. I've even seen people use these hazelnut shells because they're really good at keeping slugs at bay as well. But you definitely want some type of mulch around the plants to suppress weeds and kind of conserve soil moisture as well. Where the June bearing types, you typically kind of, fertilize them right after harvest, and that's it. With the day neutral types, you do have to fertilize them more frequently throughout the growing season. So again, with day neutrals, you want to remove the runners before the daughters get too large and actually root themselves. And you don't renovate these right after harvest. You can, you basically leave them through winter, keep them mulched for temperature regulation over winter. And then right before the next spring, you can go ahead and go through and remove all the old leaves of the plant. And that's helpful. It just kind of cleans up the growing area. If there's any, pests or anything on those old leaves, you can kind of get those out of the field as well. So go ahead and remove the straw, trim the leaves, and then it will start putting out a new flush of growth come spring. So with day neutral types, you do want to mulch. Mulch is important for weed suppression, conserving moisture. As I noted, straw mulch and other types of organic mulches are great. Keep in mind, they do attract pests. Slugs tend to love hiding under straw mulch. And I'm saying straw, not hay. Straw tends to have, fewer weed seeds, less herbicide residue on it, etc. So get straw. And then also, yeah, just keep an eye on them because slugs do like it provides habitat for those slugs and voles as well. But you know, I've done trials growing in plastic mulch, and guess what? The voles love that as well. They'll just burrow right through the plastic mulch into the raised bed. So that's not going to do very good. There's a lot of research going on into biodegradable mulches. So hopefully sometime in the near future, that type of mulch will be available on the market as well. And then you want to irrigate. And typically before you put down the mulch, it's good to have a drip line or a soaker hose, lay that down, and then put the mulch on top of it. So then all the water goes directly into the soil, right where the plants need it. If you're growing in containers, like I said, I grow a lot in just 1 gallon containers and it's sufficient. It's obviously one plant per container. I grow some in 2 gallons as well. I can't say I notice a difference in terms of yield or anything. I don't know that the extra space does a lot. I'm also not out there counting and weighing berries. So that's just an observation, not a data point. But you know, 1 or 2 gallon pots work well. This is a 14-inch wide container and you have 4 plants in them. So you can also do something like that. But yeah, they grow well. And like I said, choose day neutral types for growing in containers, not the June bearing types. And then just be sure, once again, because they're day neutral types, go ahead and remove those runners, because once again, these daughters, even, you know, they will start putting out fruit. Once they do that, they're essentially reducing the vigor of the mother plant. So you really want to remove those daughter plants before they root and start producing on their own. Okay, so they do need kind of consistent moisture. So you don't want the soil to be completely saturated that you can wring it out like a sponge, but you don't want to go from periods of where the soil is really dry to really wet. So you don't want these intermittent watering periods where you're going from wet to dry, wet to dry. So you really want to make sure that you're maintaining kind of a consistent moisture within the soil and not allowing the soil to dry out between watering. So that usually means applying about 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week during the growing season. So for, you know, day neutrals, that would be like May to August. So basically you just want to make sure that soil is wet down to at least 6 inches. Strawberry roots tend to go 6 inches deep. So you want to make sure you have consistent moisture down to that depth. If you're growing, you know, in a row where you maybe have staggered plantings, you can just run 1 drip line right through the center of it, and that will be sufficient for both plants. I recommend 1/2 gallon emitters spaced every 12 inches if you're using drip. That's usually sufficient. You can also run a soaker hose down the middle as well. Those also work well. I recommend not using overhead sprinklers or irrigation. Strawberries are really susceptible to a lot of different fungal diseases like gray mold. And all that's going to do is wet the foliage, wet the flowers, make them more susceptible. And then they're just going to kind of hit the berries and splash spores around as well and spread disease. So I do recommend either, you know, drip line, soaker hose. You know, for the ones I'm growing in container, I just water them and make sure that I'm watering at the base of the plant. So I'm just not spraying it over the entire canopy of the plant. I just manual water really low to the ground, so that I'm not getting the whole plant wet as well. And then for fertilizer, so for new plantings in the first year, they need about 0.5 to 0.8 ounces of nitrogen per 10 feet of row. And you want to apply that in split applications. So you'll do about 0.2 ounces, you know, 1 to 2 weeks after planting. If you're using a granular organic fertilizer, apply that like a month to 2 weeks before, because it's an organic fertilizer. So the nitrogen's not going to be immediately available. It has to be mineralized before it's changed. It comes in organic nitrogen form and it has to be converted into ammonium or nitrate form for the plant to be able to utilize it. So do that right around planting time. I usually start with a pre-plant feather meal as kind of a pre-plant application. And then I'll continue on with some type of relatively balanced, usually like a fish emulsion or something throughout the growing season. So after that pre-plant application, then you would want to apply another 0.2 to 0.4 ounces 1 month later. And then 2 months after planting, go ahead and do the last application for that first season, which again is 0.1 to 0.2 ounces of nitrogen per 10-foot row. And I should note, all of this is in the OSU Extension publication, Growing Strawberries in Your Home Garden. So for those of you who aren't taking notes, all this is in there. In terms of established planting, so after that first year, the second, third, fourth year, for June bearers, once again, you're just going to fertilize them that one time after renovation, and they need about 0.4 to 0.6 ounces per 10-foot row. Whereas the day neutrals, once again, you're going to do split applications and fertilize them throughout the growing season. So starting in April, you'll give them 0.1 to 0.2 ounces, another application in May, and then again in June. And then I like to give them more in August so that you get that late season production, because they can actually produce late into fall. And I was doing season extension research on these, and there was a year where we were able to grow strawberries all the way up until Thanksgiving. It obviously depends on the fall and how warm it is, and what type of season extension you're doing. If you have like a closed greenhouse that stays very warm, you can actually produce them extend the season for several months. If it's something like an open air hoop house, probably into late October, early November, you can get good production out of those. So it's good to go ahead and give them a little extra fertilizer in August to help kind of push out the season and continue stimulate those plants to continue putting out strawberries into the fall months as well. In terms of harvesting, typically with the June bearers, you want to try to pick them without the caps. That'll save you a lot of time in the kitchen if you're making something like jams from having to go through and cut them off. And then for day neutrals, you typically want the cap on. That helps kind of conserve the shelf life of the strawberry itself by leaving it intact. As a home gardener, I recommend harvesting at 100% ripeness. Obviously, for commercial growers, the USDA requires at least 75% ripeness. They will continue ripening after harvest, but they obviously aren't as sweet. I do sometimes have to pick at 75% ripeness because I have a little fat gray squirrel that loves to come around and steal my berries right when they hit about 90% ripeness. So, it depends on what you're battling, but if you can let them go until they're fully ripe, you're going to have some really good tasting strawberries. So let's talk about some common pest problems. Is everyone okay? Any questions so far? Am I talking too fast? Okay, great. Thank you. So they are really susceptible to frost damage. So once you get temperatures below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and you have open flowers, they can get frost damage. And typically what you'll see is kind of that pistil area of the flower will basically turn black. And that's how you know that it was in fact damaged by plants. Sometimes if you just get partial damage, like maybe it just dipped below 30 for a short period of time and you get a little frost damage, you may end up with this deformation that's often referred to as a monkey face. So, and you can kind of see the black spot right there. That was essentially the center of the flower that was damaged by the frost. So you can do things like use frost cloth if you see that the temperatures are going to dip really low, and that's pretty common in the spring, especially like April, May. It's good to kind of keep an eye on even nighttime temperatures, so we can have some really cold springs here. This one's looking like we might have a warm spring so far, but some years it can be really cold, so keep an eye on that. And if they're flowering and you see it's going to dip below 30 degrees, throw some frost cloth over the plants until that period of frost has passed. If you have potted plants, you can bring them inside. My living room was packed with potted plants during the ice storm. So, you can also just bring them indoors. Poor pollination. There's a couple of things that cause catfacing, which is what you see in these photos here. It's just a type of deformation of the strawberry where it's not a fully formed fruit. There's a number of things that can cause that. One is cold weather or wet weather during bloom. There's also like insect feeding. The most common in Oregon is lygus bug, can cause catfacing. Thrips. We don't have as many thrips here in Oregon, Western flower thrips, or at least in the Willamette Valley, I should say, compared to say California, but they can also cause catfacing. Nutrient deficiencies can also cause that as well. Botrytis or gray mold is probably one of the most common issues. How many of you have seen gray mold? Yeah, half the room. In their strawberries. This is very common. Basically it happens just you get really wet canopy and wet foliage during bloom. So again, that's where sprinkler irrigation isn't ideal, because it not only helps cause this, but then it will hit these berries, the splashes, and splash all these spores around. So you do want to pick this, basically rotted fruit and get it out of the field. Don't just drop it in the aisles next to your plant, but put them in a bucket and send them off. If you have a hot compost, you can put them in your hot compost. If you don't hot compost, then, put them in yard waste or something like that. But you do want to pick those berries off. Anthracnose is also pretty common, aggregated by dense canopy, but basically you kind of get this spot on the fruit that kind of hardens. So it's often referred to as leather rot. And that's also caused by kind of humid conditions and warm weather. So those are pretty common. There's a number of other things, powdery mildew as well. You tend to typically see that in the spring. This particular species of powdery mildew, really it's favorable in conditions between like 60 and 80 degrees. So you typically see this in the springtime. And then it doesn't reproduce spores once it's hotter than 85 degrees. So it will often go away for a few months in summer, but then kind of make a return again in the fall. Strawberries are also susceptible to a number of soil-borne pathogens like verticillium wilt. We actually had fusarium in our trial one year. We think it came in through the plant nursery. We aren't sure. Phytophthora root rot, they're really susceptible to that. There's others as well. So again, make sure you're growing in raised beds with well-drained soil. That will help at least prevent the spread of these things. And then there's another number of insects as well. The most common is SWD, spotted winged Drosophila. It's a fruit fly, was first actually detected down in California around 2009. That's actually when I was in California working in the strawberry industry. And at that time, if you found it in any field, that field had to be quarantined and they would just come in and destroy basically all the beds and the fruit in it. So naturally farmers were not reporting it, and it quickly spread from California all the way up through the Pacific Northwest. And it's not just a pest of strawberries, but pretty much any red fruit or reddish fruit. So blueberries, raspberries, mulberries, cherries, and of course the strawberry as well. And one thing that, makes them difficult to deal with is a lot of fruit flies, they really only attack the fruit once it's overripe. These will attack even just ripening fruit as well. So basically the fly lands, it lays an egg, kind of right underneath the skin of the fruit. That egg hatches, and these little white things you see in the berry there, that's actually the larva. And so the larvae just start feeding their way through the flesh of the fruit, and then you get basically rotted fruit. So it's a very common pest. I always tell people, if you're eating berries in the summer, especially organic ones, you're probably getting a little extra protein with those berries. One thing you can do if you're really curious, you might not want to do this, but you can take your fruit and mush it up and kind of immerse them in like a salt bath. And then all the larvae will essentially float to the top, and that will let you know whether or not you have them or not. So it's a little test you can do for fun. Strawberry aphids are also fairly common. They don't cause a lot of damage. So they're one of those things where I just kind of think about tolerance level, and I tend to just kind of ignore strawberry aphids, but they can grow, as with aphids, they can kind of explode in population and really become problematic. But usually if you're spraying for something like spotted winged Drosophila or the lygus bug, you're going to wipe out the strawberry aphid right along with it. And then lygus is also a problem as well. And they tend to emerge midsummer. They have that kind of distinctive diamond or shaped back. They're very fast little leaf hoppers. They jump around very quickly. And then they cause that catfacing that you typically see in the fruit. And then there's also the strawberry crown moth as well. So those are kind of probably the four most common insect pests that you'll see here in Oregon. Yes. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but basically picking fruit as soon as it's ripening is one of the best things that you can do, not leaving ripened or overripened fruit on the plant. So that's one of the better things you'll do, but I'll talk about that a little more. So for slugs, yeah, they love strawberries too. I don't blame them. There's a lot of different ways to control slugs. There's actually some research that came out of Oregon State here. Forget the name of the professor that was working on it, but he found that one of their favorite things is dough, bread dough. And so he's as a bait and a trap. And apparently they're kind of attracted to that fermentation and which is very similar to why beer traps tend to work as well. But he said that they tested several baits and it was the bread dough that was essentially the most attractive to the slugs. So you can, drop those into a tin and go out in the morning and, like a little buried yogurt container with some dough in it and, come out in the morning and check. And if you have a bunch of slugs in them, just drop them into a bucket of soapy water or something and get rid of them. Or you can make kind of a slurry with the bread dough as well. And again, put them into like a buried yogurt container and then they'll fall into the slurry and drown. So that's a couple different ways that you can use that. Obviously, a lot of people probably try beer traps. I like board traps as well, where you take a piece of board, kind of lay it on the ground and then you tip it up and they'll all be kind of congregating underneath the board. And then again, you can just flick them into a bucket of soapy water and that should take care of them. There are obviously baits. I always tell people if you have dogs and cats, be really careful using these around the house or even grandkids or children, young children running around. You don't want them to consume those baits, so be careful with those. Rodents love them too. Sorry about the photos, but these are from my research trial. We had a serious vole problem. So those are basically little field mice. And then gophers also love them. The thing that's really annoying about voles is they like to just take like a bite out of the berry and then move on to the next one. They don't even consume the whole berry. But yeah, basically with voles, you tend to just kind of see these holes in the ground and then you'll maybe see their runways growing along the grasses. And then with gophers, you get more of these horse-shaped mounds, and trapping is pretty much the best method that you can use to control them. Again, Nick Andrews here at OSU is doing research on using dogs to kind of sniff out vole holes so you can figure out which ones are most active. My research assistant, when I was doing season extension research, had a little, it was a mutt, a mixed dog, but it had some terrier in it, like rat terriers. That's where they got their names, as they were basically rodent hunters naturally. And so her dog would go through that field and just sniff out, because we had hundreds of holes. It gets to the point where you're like, okay, which ones are the active holes that the voles are actually still living in? And her dog would go out there and just sniff them out really quickly. And that's how we knew where to set our traps, essentially, in the field. So you can train your dog to also help sniff them out for you. So let's go through some of the different methods of control. For lygus bug, they're tough. If you have a vacuum, you can vacuum them up off the plant. Most people don't have bug vacuums. There are some sprays you can use like neem and pyrethrin, Bavaria bassiana as well. For spotted winged Drosophila, as I said, removing and destroying ripe or overripe fruit or rotten fruit is really the best method. You can also trap. You can use these yeast, sugar, vinegar waters. I once asked a grower, a blueberry grower, if they trapped for SWD because you use like these yeast vinegar traps, and he told me no, because he thought it attracted them to the field. So, I'll let you make your own decision on whether or not you want to trap or not, but just getting rid of the ripened and overripe fruit. And then there are some sprays you can do with spinosad. Be careful, don't overuse it. There's a lot of concern about resistance buildup. Fruit flies tend to, repopulate very quickly. There's always concerns about that. And spinosad is one of the few organic insecticides that we have available that is actually effective. Aphids, just be careful not to over fertilize. Again, these are mostly organic insecticides that I'm recommending, but things like spinosad, neem, etc. One thing to note, pyrethrin is actually toxic to bees. So keep in mind that oftentimes when you're spraying strawberries, they are in bloom. So be conscious of that. Select your pesticides carefully. Try to select things that aren't toxic to honeybees and other types of pollinators when spraying. And as a home gardener, you can always tolerate a bit more damage, right? You aren't going to lose a bunch of money if all of a sudden you have some pest damage in your crop. So really focus on kind of cultural and physical control methods before having to resort to those pesticides, because you are going to be spraying plants when they're in bloom, when, bees or honeybees are congregating. If we had the spray spinosad for SWD, we would spray at night when the bees are less active. So you spray in the evening after the sun has gone down. And then it gives that insecticide time to dry on the plant itself, so that by the time the sun comes out, the next morning and the bees are foraging, they aren't actually exposed to the spray. So that's the other thing is if you do have to spray a blooming plant, do so in the evening at night when the bees are less active. Ants can be a problem as well. Just try to pick your berries. There are those little boron traps and things you can put out. Rodents, you can try trapping in owl boxes. For powdery mildew, removing and destroying the old leaves. There are some plant resistant cultivars. There's some, bicarbonate based pesticides like millstop that can be used to control it as well. For gray mold, plant spacing is important. Using drip irrigation is important as well to keep the foliage dry. And then again, mulching, picking ripe fruit. And once you get those berries with that gray mold on them, that's just an inoculum sitting there in the field. So it is important to get those out. And like I said, put them in a bucket and get them out of the field. Don't just drop them in the aisle or toss them away. Get them out of there. For something like anthracnose, try to use certified disease-free plants, plant spacing, drip irrigation. So you're kind of seeing a common thing for like powdery mildew, gray mold, anthracnose, drip irrigation, right? Try to keep the leaves dry. Proper plant spacing so that there's good air circulation around the plant that reduces humidity and other conditions that are really favorable to funguses. So those are the types of things that you're really going to want to practice to prevent those. Root rot, if you get Phytophthora or verticillium wilt, really you got to rotate out. A lot of the organic growers down in California, they would rotate their strawberries with broccoli because, and I lived in Santa Cruz for many years. And, this is at the time when they were really phasing out methyl bromide, which is a ozone depleting soil fumigant. And so people were looking at, well, how are people growing organic strawberries? Here's the conventional strawberry industry being like, we need methyl bromide. We can't produce without them. And it's like, well, just down the road, we have some organic growers that produce very beautiful strawberries without methyl bromide. So what are they doing? And what they're doing is rotating with broccoli. And so broccoli and other mustard crops are kind of biofumigant plants because they have a chemical in them. It's isothiocyanide. And basically, when you harvest broccoli, you take the head of the broccoli and what's left behind are those leaves and the stem. So they would go through the field and chip all that up and then turn it into the soil. And then once it started degrading, it would release those isothiocyanides into the soil, which would then suppress verticillium wilt and some of the other soil-borne pathogens as well. So that's kind of a, organic method of growing them without using nasty chemicals. But for home gardeners, you're probably just going to have to rotate out and find a different area of your garden to grow strawberries in for a very long time.
How effective is solarization?
It's pretty effective. I did some solarization research down in Sacramento. It's tough to do here. Like in the Sacramento Valley, it works well because it's like 90 degrees starting in May, And so you need about 6 to 8 weeks of like really hot weather where it's the ambient temperature is probably at least 95 degrees, so that it really bakes that soil for a long period of time. And then you have to like water the soil, make sure it's moist so it's conducting heat through it. But it does work well. The challenge here in Oregon is getting a sunny enough window and a hot enough period during those summer months for it to be effective. But there is a colleague up at NREC doing solarization research here, and she's had some success with it during the summer months. Okay, so that's kind of it for me. I do want to point out that we have a number of great publications on strawberry growing in the OSU Extension catalog. So as I noted, the growing strawberries in your home garden, that's pretty much all my presentation is housed up and summarized within that publication. So if you weren't taking notes, just go ahead and look that one up. If there's anyone online or in this room that grows over closer to the coast, we do have one called Growing Berries on the Oregon coast that's focused on strawberries as well. So kind of growing in their soil conditions over there. If you're trying to figure out what cultivar you want to actually plant, there's a whole publication on strawberry cultivars for Western Oregon and Washington, and goes through both June bearing and day neutral types. And then I did some low tunnel season extension research, and we have a publication on building low tunnels, which are basically miniature hoop houses that just cover a single row to extend the strawberry season. So if you're interested in looking at how we built those low tunnels or developing some yourselves, we do have a low season publication as well. And so with that, I'll go ahead and open it up to questions. I'll start here in the room and then I'll move to the chat box. So yes.
One question, the runners, are they considered new plants or are they considered year-old plants?
They would be considered new plants.
So if you took the runners and started another space.
Yeah, people do propagate them that way. We generally don't recommend it because that's you tend to transmit viruses that way. So you can't, you can't always guarantee that you're going to get a healthy daughter plant off of it. But I know a lot of people that do that. I probably should throw out a clause about plant patents and plant propagation, just make sure you aren't selling them or something like that if you're doing that.
We're doing the 4-year plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So by the time you get to year 3, you could essentially propagate some daughter plants and then replant them and start all over again.
Okay.
Yep. And I know people that do that, what they do is they'll just have like a tray of soil and they'll train the runner into that tray of soil so that it roots in that tray of soil. And then once it's rooted, they just cut the runner and then you can walk off with that new daughter plant and essentially in a nice tray where it grows well. Are there any other questions in the room? Oh, good. Okay. So
I want to talk about like SWD and buying them from the market because I might be.
what do you mean? What about them? Well, I'm not sure even sure what you're referring to, so I'll let you go.
But you find that SWD and berry, they can't be exported out of the country.
Okay.
There's a ban, so if they go to Asia, they can't go to Asia anymore. And
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah. So there are quarantines. Sorry, I didn't know where you were going with that. But yeah, there's basically a restriction about selling or exporting berries overseas that do have SWD, and they typically will do random tests and select for them. And then if they do find them, basically that crop gets rejected. You as home gardeners probably don't have to worry about that. You probably aren't shipping your strawberries off to other countries. But yeah, it is interesting. And it does kind of, I think I always talk to home gardeners about, you can make different pest management issues than commercial growers do. People really give commercial growers a hard time about pesticides, but they're also kind of under pressure to basically produce a perfect crop with 0 pest incidents, and that's a prime example of that. Like they could essentially lose their whole market if they end up having SWD within their crop. So, but as a home gardener, you can make different decisions, about what you do for pest control and how often and what you use and things like that. You can tolerate a little pest damage. You can handle a little scab on your apple or a few larvae in your berries and things like that. So, yeah. Yeah. It'll just be stunted and not as vigorous. Yes. Yes, thank you for the reminder. So she was asking what happens if you get a J-rooted plant, and it just won't grow as vigorous. It'll be smaller, stunted, and you aren't going to get as big of flowers and berries off of it. So if you want a really vigorous plant that's going to grow well and produce well for a good 3 or 4 years, you want to try to prevent that from happening. So, yes.
I had a question about growing strawberries in containers.
Yeah.
You showed a container that was 14 inches wide, but it had 4 plants.
Yeah.
So those aren't
No.
apart. How closely can you plant in a large container?
I mean, I would still try to stick close to that 12 inches, maybe 8 inches would probably be as low as I would go. Again, at that point, then you're starting to worry about, are the plants competing for the water and nutrients? So yeah, I wouldn't go less than 8 inches plant spacing. But you can grow them fairly dense. They just might not grow as big, as vigorous, things like that. But like I said, I just put them in gallon pots. But try to stick close to the 12-inch spacing if you can, but you can grow them pretty densely as well. Yes.
Anecdotally, how many pounds of strawberries do you get for your 1 gallon?
Oh, I'm bad at those kinds of numbers. She wants to know how many like pints or gallons you get per year. Yeah, off the top of my head, I'd just be making something up, so I won't go there.
I'm just curious if it was room by
To grow strawberries?
one.
Oh, okay. I think so. It depends on how many plants you have. I probably have about 10 plants growing in 1 gallon pots. So I do get quite a few berries off of them. But yeah, for me, I can go out and pick a couple a week and put them in my yogurt and fruit and things like that. For me, my biggest issue is I have a lot of deer and voles that tend to beat me to the fruit. So they tend to enjoy it a bit more than I do. So. Any other questions?
Can you extend the shelf life of June strawberries when you buy them from the market?
I mean, get them in the
Like, it feels like it's
refrigerator.
Like one day, like.
Yeah, get them in a cooler as quickly as possible. Try to store them as close to 34 degrees or so as you can. So yeah, get them in like a low portion of your refrigerator, and that will help. And then just be prepared. Like, yeah, I always tell people with June berries, be prepared to either eat them immediately or process them somehow. Make a little strawberry compote to put over your ice cream that night or something like that. Any other questions? Okay, so I asked at the end how many grow strawberries. How many are gonna go grow strawberries now? Okay, a couple extra more. That's good. I convinced a few people. I did my job. So good. All right. Were there any questions in the chat? You said there
No.
were none.
I've just been rephrasing.
Okay,
I'll ask.
great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time.
We have trees and.
Then